The manipulative wealthy CEO divorce with ex-wife was final, until he found out about the secret twins. Are they mine? The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Nora's face went pale as she stared at the man who had destroyed her world 18 months ago. When should I have told you, Garrett? Her voice was ice-cold steel. When you were working 18-hour days. When you told me you weren't ready for children and might never be. Or maybe when you accused me of trying to manipulate you with biological terrorism. Wasn't that your charming phrase? Garrett's hands trembled as he held up the newspaper photograph. Two identical toddlers with unmistakable blue eyes stared back at him from the society pages. I found out I was pregnant 2 weeks after you served me divorce papers, Nora continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. You made it crystal clear that I was holding you back, that domestic life wasn't compatible with your vision of success. So I let you go. But I had a right to know, you had a right to the choice you made. You chose your company over our marriage. I chose our children over your guilt and resentment. And then, the moment that would shatter everything he thought he knew about himself. Are you my daddy? The innocent question came from a little girl tugging on his expensive suit jacket, her green eyes, his eyes, looking up at him with pure curiosity. Welcome back to Lux Love Chronicles with Mr. Wentworth, where we dive deep into stories that will touch your soul and change the way you see love, success, and what truly matters in life. To my incredible subscribers, thank you for being part of this amazing community. Your likes, comments, and shares mean the world to me, and it's because of you that we can continue bringing these powerful stories to life. Now, let's dive into today's incredible story, a tale that will make you question everything you think you know about success, love, and second chances. The divorce papers had been signed for exactly 18 months when Garrett Manning's world imploded with a single photograph. Picture this. It's a Tuesday morning in Manhattan. The kind of crisp October day where the autumn air cuts through the glass towers of Wall Street like a promise of change. But change was the last thing on Garrett Manning's mind as he sat in his corner office on the 42nd floor, the city sprawling beneath him like a conquered kingdom. At 34, Garrett had everything the world told him to want. His tech company, Manning Dynamics, was valued at $2.8 billion. His penthouse apartment featured floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park. His name appeared on Forbes lists and magazine covers. He commanded boardrooms with the precision of a military general and the cold calculation of a chess master. But on this particular morning, as he sat behind his mahogany desk worth more than most people's cars, Garrett felt something he rarely allowed himself to acknowledge: emptiness. He reached for his coffee, imported, expensive, bitter, and unfolded the Wall Street Journal with the mechanical precision that governed every aspect of his life. Business section first, then technology, then the cup slipped from his fingers. Coffee splattered across the Italian marble floor, but Garrett didn't notice. His entire world had narrowed to a single photograph on the society page. There she was, Nora Caldwell, his ex-wife, radiant in an emerald gown at some charity gala. Her honey blonde hair caught the camera's flash, and her smile was warm and genuine in a way that made his chest ache with memory. But it wasn't Nora that stopped his breath. It was the two identical toddlers in her arms. Dark hair, unmistakable facial structure, and those eyes, those piercing blue eyes that had been passed down through 3 generations of Manning men. Mr. Manning? His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom like a distant echo. Your 3 o'clock is here. Garrett couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. The children in the photo couldn't be more than 15 months old, which meant. The calculation hit him like a physical blow. 18 months since the divorce. 9 months of pregnancy. The timeline was impossible to deny. Cancel everything, he managed, his voice hoarse and unfamiliar to his own ears. I need to go. Sir? What about the Meridian merger? The board is expecting. Cancel everything. He was out the door before she could respond, leaving behind board meetings that would cost millions, merger discussions that would reshape entire industries, and the empire he'd built at the cost of everything that truly mattered. The elevator ride to the parking garage felt like a descent into hell. Each floor that passed brought a fresh wave of memory. Each ding of the elevator a countdown to a reckoning he'd never seen coming. You see, Garrett Manning hadn't always been the cold, calculating CEO who prioritized profit margins over people. Once upon a time, he'd been a man capable of love. Once upon a time, he'd had everything that mattered, and he'd thrown it all away. 3 years earlier, Garrett had met Nora Caldwell at a tech startup launch party in Soho. She was 28, brilliant, and working as a senior marketing executive for a Fortune 500 company. While other women at the party seemed impressed by his growing wealth and influence, Nora had challenged him. "So you're the genius behind those productivity apps that are making everyone work themselves to death," she'd said, raising an eyebrow over her wine glass. "I prefer to think of them as tools for optimization," Garrett had replied, intrigued despite himself. "Optimization," she'd repeated, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "That's a fancy way of saying you've found a way to monetize human exhaustion." Most people were intimidated by Garrett's intensity. Nora seemed genuinely amused by it. They talked until 3 a.m. about everything except business, books, travel, dreams, the kind of life they wanted to build. For the first time in years, Garrett had forgotten to check his phone, forgotten to think about tomorrow's meetings, forgotten about anything except the way Nora's eyes lit up when she laughed. 6 months later, he'd proposed on a beach in Santorini, and she'd said yes with tears streaming down her face. "I love you, Garrett Manning," she'd whispered against his lips as the Mediterranean sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "Not your money, not your success, not your empire. Just you." It should have been the beginning of their happily ever after. Instead, it was the beginning of the end. You know how they say absolute power corrupts absolutely? Well, Garrett learned that absolute ambition can poison everything it touches, including love. The first year of marriage had been blissful. Nora had her own successful career, her own dreams, her own life. They were partners in every sense of the word, supporting each other, challenging each other, building something beautiful together. But as Manning Dynamics grew from a promising startup to a billion-dollar empire, Garrett began to change. Success became a drug, and like any addiction, it demanded more and more of him until there was nothing left for anyone else. 18-hour workdays became the norm. Business trips stretched from days to weeks. Family dinners were interrupted by urgent calls that couldn't wait. Date nights were canceled for board meetings. Conversations became dominated by stock prices and market projections. "When was the last time we just talked?" Nora had asked him one evening, finding him hunched over his laptop at the kitchen table at midnight. "We're talking now," Garrett had replied without looking up from his screen. "No, we're not. I'm talking. You're working. There's a difference. Nora, please. This acquisition could change everything for the company. Just give me 5 more minutes." Those 5 minutes had stretched into hours. When he'd finally made it to bed, Nora was asleep, turned away from him, and the distance between them felt like an ocean. But the real poison hadn't been the work itself. It had been the way Garrett began to see everything, including his marriage, as something to be optimized, controlled, managed. When Nora started talking about having children, about slowing down to build a family, Garrett saw it as a threat to his carefully constructed empire. "The timing isn't right," he'd said during one particularly heated conversation. "Maybe in a few years, when the company is more stable." There's never going to be a right time, Garrett. There's always going to be another deal, another opportunity, another reason to wait. That's not true. I just need to get to a certain point. What point? Nora's voice had been sharp with frustration. When you have 2 billion? 3? When exactly is enough going to be enough? Garrett had looked at her like she was speaking a foreign language. In his world, there was no such thing as enough. There was only more success, more power, more control. And when Nora had finally gotten pregnant after 2 years of marriage, Garrett's reaction had been everything she'd feared and nothing she'd hoped for. The pregnancy announcement had come on a Thursday evening in February. Garrett had been in his home office, naturally, preparing for a board meeting that would determine the fate of a hostile takeover he'd been orchestrating for months. Nora had knocked on the door, something she rarely did during his work hours. She'd learned, through painful experience, that interrupting Garrett's work was like stepping into a minefield. "Garrett, can I talk to you for a minute? Kind of in the middle of something crucial here. Nora, can it wait until after? I'm pregnant." The words had hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. Garrett's fingers had frozen over his keyboard. He'd turned slowly in his chair to look at his wife, standing in the doorway in her pajamas, holding a small white stick in her trembling hands. For a moment, just one brief, shining moment, something had flickered in Garrett's chest. A warmth, a possibility, a glimpse of a different kind of future. And then the fear had crashed over him like a tidal wave. Are you sure? I took 3 tests. They're all positive. Garrett had stared at her, his mind racing through calculations that had nothing to do with joy and everything to do with control. A baby meant hospital visits during crucial negotiations. It meant sleepless nights when he needed to be sharp for meetings. It meant Nora's attention divided, her career potentially derailed, their carefully organized life thrown into chaos. Jesus, Nora. The timing, this couldn't be worse. The hurt that had flashed across her face had been immediate and devastating, but Garrett had been too caught up in his own panic to notice. Timing, she'd whispered. We're talking about our child, Garrett. Our baby. I know that. There's so much happening with the company right now. The tech flow merger, the expansion into Europe, the IPO filing, there's always something happening with the company. Nora's voice had risen, months of frustration finally boiling over. When exactly were you planning to fit a family into your schedule? Between the quarterly reports and the shareholder meetings. That's not fair. You know how important this year is for manning dynamics. If we can just wait until things settle down, wait. Nora had stared at him like he'd grown a second head. Garrett, I'm pregnant. This isn't a board meeting you can reschedule. This is our child. And that's when Garrett had said the words that would destroy everything beautiful they'd ever built together. Maybe this is a sign that we're not ready. Maybe we should consider all our options. The silence that had followed was deafening. Nora had gone completely still, the pregnancy test slipping from her fingers to clatter on the hardwood floor. Options. Her voice had been barely a whisper. I'm suggesting we think about this logically. We're young. There will be other chances when the timing is better. Get out. Nora, please, let's discuss this rationally. Get out. The words had been a scream, raw and primal, and full of a pain so deep it had seemed to echo off the walls. Get out of this room. Get out of this house. Get out of my life. You're being emotional. Let's talk about this tomorrow when you've had time to. I said get out. Garrett had left, telling himself that Nora needed time to cool down, time to see the logic in his position. He'd gone to his office, buried himself in work, convinced himself that morning would bring clarity and compromise. Instead, morning had brought divorce papers. When Nora filed for divorce, Garrett had actually felt relieved. I know that sounds impossible. How could any man feel relieved about losing the love of his life? But Garrett had become a master at convincing himself that anything threatening his control was actually a burden he was better off without. She was holding me back anyway, he told himself as he signed the papers without contest. Marriage was just another obligation, another distraction from what really matters. He transferred a substantial sum to her account, enough money to ensure she'd never want for anything. In his mind, this was generosity. In reality, it was guilt money, a way to assuage his conscience without actually examining the choices he'd made. This is better for both of us, he'd convinced himself. Now I can focus on building something that will last, something important. The irony, of course, was that in choosing to build an empire, he'd destroyed a kingdom. Manning Dynamics had thrived in the months following his divorce. Freed from the distraction of marriage, Garrett had thrown himself into work with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The TechFlow merger had been a massive success. The European expansion had exceeded all projections. The IPO had made him one of the youngest billionaires in tech. But success, Garrett discovered, was a cold bedfellow. His penthouse apartment, featured in Architectural Digest, felt like a museum. His social calendar was full of networking events and business dinners, but he couldn't remember the last time he'd had a real conversation with another human being. He dated occasionally, beautiful women who were impressed by his wealth and status, but every relationship felt hollow, transactional. Sometimes, in the quiet moments between meetings, he'd find himself thinking about Nora, wondering what she was doing, whether she was happy, whether she'd found someone who could give her the family she'd wanted. But he'd push those thoughts away buried them under spreadsheets and profit margins in the relentless pursuit of more. Until today. Until the photograph that had shattered the careful walls he'd built around his heart. The drive from Manhattan to Brooklyn Heights had never felt longer. Every red light was torture, every memory a fresh wound. Garrett's hands gripped the steering wheel of his Maserati like it was the only thing keeping him anchored to reality. The photograph was on the passenger seat beside him, and every time he glanced at it, his chest tightened with a mixture of wonder and devastating regret. 2 children. Twins. His children. How had he not known? How had 18 months passed without him having any idea that he was a father? But even as the questions tormented him, he knew the answers. He'd made it crystal clear that he wanted no part of domestic life. He'd walked away without a backward glance. He'd chosen his empire over his family, and Nora had simply given him exactly what he'd asked for. The brownstone in Brooklyn Heights was exactly the kind of home Nora had always dreamed of, warm, welcoming, with flower boxes in the windows and a small garden where children could play. It was everything his sterile penthouse wasn't, everything he'd convinced himself he didn't want. Now, staring at her front door, he realized how catastrophically wrong he'd been about everything. His legs felt unsteady as he climbed the front steps. His hand shook as he reached for the doorbell. And when the door opened, revealing the woman he'd walked away from 18 months ago, Garrett felt something he hadn't experienced in years. He felt human again. Nora answered on the second knock. For a heartbeat, time stood completely still. Garrett drank in the sight of the woman he'd loved and lost. She was even more beautiful than he remembered, but different somehow. Softer. There was a maternal glow about her that made his chest ache with recognition of all the moments he'd missed. Her face cycled through emotions like a storm system, shock, anger, fear, and something that might have been pain. She was dressed casually in jeans and a soft blue sweater, her honey blonde hair shorter now, brushing her shoulders instead of cascading down her back like it used to. Garrett. Her voice was steady, but he caught the slight tremor underneath. What are you doing here? Behind her, he could hear something that made his heart clench, the sound of children laughing. High, pure notes of joy that seemed to pierce straight through the walls he'd built around his emotions. I saw the photograph. He held up the Wall Street Journal with hands that weren't quite steady. In the journal, the color drained from Nora's face so quickly that Garrett instinctively stepped forward, thinking she might faint. But she steadied herself against the doorframe, her knuckles white with the force of her grip. You need to leave, she said quietly, but made no move to close the door. Are they mine? The question escaped before he could stop it, raw and desperate and full of 18 months of sudden, devastating understanding. The question hung between them like a blade. Nora's composure cracked, just for a moment, and Garrett saw the woman he'd fallen in love with 5 years ago, vulnerable, fierce, and achingly beautiful. Mommy. A small voice called from inside. Who's at the door? Garrett's breath caught in his throat. Without invitation, without permission, he stepped forward. And somehow, miraculously, Nora didn't stop him. The living room was everything his penthouse wasn't, warm, lived in, full of color and chaos and love. Toys were scattered across a bright yellow rug. Crayon drawings covered the refrigerator. Family photos lined the mantel, chronicling moments and milestones he'd never been part of. And there, sitting on a colorful play mat surrounded by blocks and picture books, were 2 of the most beautiful children Garrett had ever seen. They looked up at him with identical expressions of curiosity, and Garrett felt the world tilt on its axis. They had Nora's nose, her smile, the same stubborn tilt to their chins. But their eyes, oh God, their eyes were his. That distinctive Manning blue that had been passed down through 3 generations. Hey there, he said softly, crouching down to their level. His voice caught on the words. This is Henry, Nora said reluctantly, gesturing to the boy who was methodically stacking blocks with the focused intensity of a master architect. And Grace. The little girl had abandoned her coloring to stare at Garrett with unabashed fascination. She had paint smudges on her fingers and a streak of purple across her cheek, and she was absolutely perfect. Hi, Garrett, Grace said solemnly, as if she'd been practicing his name. The words hit Garrett like a physical blow. Nora's sharp intake of breath told him everything he needed to know. You told them about me. It wasn't a question. They asked about their father. Nora's voice was defensive, but there was something else underneath, a mother's fierce protectiveness. I wasn't going to lie to them. Garrett stood slowly, his eyes never leaving his children. Because they were his, he was certain now. The resemblance was undeniable. Henry had his grandfather's serious expression, the same analytical way of examining the world. Grace had his mother's artistic soul, but his family's stubborn streak. Why didn't you tell me? The words came out as barely a whisper. That's when Nora's composure finally shattered. When her voice cut through the room like a whip. When you were working 18-hour days. When you told me you weren't ready for children and might never be. Or maybe when you accused me of trying to manipulate you with biological terrorism. Wasn't that your charming phrase? The words hit him like physical blows. He remembered that fight, remembered the cruel things he'd said when fear and ambition had made him lash out at the person he loved most. I found out I was pregnant 2 weeks after you served me divorce papers, Nora continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. You made it crystal clear that I was holding you back, that domestic life wasn't compatible with your vision of success. So I let you go. But I had a right to know, you had a right to the choice you made. Her eyes blazed with a fury that had been building for 18 months. You chose your company over our marriage. I chose our children over your guilt and resentment. The truth of it burned through Garrett like acid. He had been so consumed with building his business empire that he'd systematically destroyed everything else. He convinced himself that love was a weakness, that emotional attachments were liabilities in the corporate world. I was wrong, he said quietly, his voice breaking on the words. About everything. Nora studied his face, searching for something, sincerity, maybe, or manipulation. The woman who had once trusted him completely now looked at him like he was a stranger capable of anything. Wrong enough to walk away again when things get complicated, she challenged. Because children aren't a board meeting, Garrett. You can't reschedule them when something more important comes up. Before he could answer, Grace toddled over and tugged on his expensive suit jacket with paint-stained fingers. Are you my daddy? The simple question destroyed him. Every wall he'd built, every justification he'd constructed, every lie he'd told himself, it all crumbled in the face of those 4 innocent words. Garrett knelt down again, his throat tight with emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. I'd like to be, if that's okay with you. Grace considered this seriously, tilting her head in a gesture so much like Nora that his heart clenched. Then she nodded with the grave dignity of someone making a very important decision. Okay. But you have to ask Mommy first. Over the little girl's head, Garrett met Nora's eyes. The anger was still there, burning bright and justified. But underneath it, barely visible, was something else, a flicker of the love they'd once shared. Nora, he said softly, his voice raw with everything he couldn't say. May I please get to know my children? The custody arrangement started tentatively, like 2 wounded animals circling each other. Saturday afternoons at the park, carefully supervised visits where Nora watched his every interaction with the intensity of a hawk protecting her nest. Garrett couldn't blame her. He was, essentially, a stranger to his own children. But slowly, impossibly, trust began to build. Henry, serious and thoughtful like his mother, warmed up first. He was fascinated by Garrett's watch, a complicated Swiss timepiece that displayed multiple time zones and had more functions than most computers. What's that for? Henry asked, pointing to a small dial during their second visit. That shows the time in Tokyo, Garrett explained, surprised by how much he enjoyed the boy's endless curiosity. Why do you need to know what time it is in Tokyo? Because I do business all over the world. When it's morning here, it might be nighttime there. Do the people in Tokyo go to bed when we eat breakfast? Sometimes. Henry absorbed this information with the serious concentration of a scholar. That's weird. Garrett laughed, actually laughed, for the first time in months. Yeah, buddy. It kind of is. Grace was more reserved, studying Garrett with the same analytical intensity he brought to hostile takeovers. She would sit just close enough to be included in conversations, but far enough away to make a quick escape if needed. But she was always watching, always listening, filing away information about this strange man who claimed to be her father. The breakthrough came 3 weeks later, during a particularly difficult afternoon at Prospect Park. Grace had been running. She was always running. That child. like she was trying to catch the wind itself, when she hit a patch of uneven ground and went down hard. The scraped knee was minor, but the tears were major, the kind of dramatic sobs that only toddlers could produce. While Nora knelt beside their daughter, cleaning the wound with gentle efficiency, Henry had what could only be described as a complete nuclear meltdown. The kind of tantrum that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, exhaustion, hunger, the stress of watching his sister get hurt, all colliding in perfect storm of toddler emotion. Without thinking, without calculating, without considering the implications, Garrett scooped up the screaming boy and began walking. He rubbed soothing circles on Henry's back the way he'd seen Nora do, murmuring wordless comfort in a voice he didn't recognize as his own. Hey, it's okay. Grace is fine. Mommy's got her. You're okay. I've got you." To everyone's surprise, most of all his own, Henry gradually calmed. The sobs turned to hiccups, the hiccups to sniffles, and eventually, impossibly, the little boy fell asleep against Garrett's shoulder. "How did you know to do that?" Nora asked softly, her earlier tension replaced by something that looked like wonder. "I didn't," Garrett admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "I just wanted to help." Something shifted between them in that moment. Nora's walls didn't come down completely, but a crack appeared, enough for him to glimpse the woman who'd once loved him unconditionally. "He never does that with strangers," she said quietly, watching her son sleep peacefully in his father's arms. "I'm not a stranger," Garrett replied, surprising himself with the fierce protectiveness in his voice. "I'm his father." It was the first time he'd said the words out loud, and they felt both foreign and absolutely right on his tongue. The real test came 2 weeks later, when Grace got sick with a fever that spiked to 103 degrees. Garrett's phone rang at 2 a.m., jarring him from the restless sleep that had become his norm. He'd been dreaming about his children, something that happened more and more frequently now, when the harsh ring cut through the darkness. "Garrett," Nora's voice was tight with panic. "I'm taking Grace to the emergency room. I thought you should know." He was out of bed before she finished the sentence, pulling on clothes with shaking hands. "Which hospital?" "Brooklyn Methodist." "But you don't have to. I'll be there in 20 minutes. His driver broke several speed limits getting from Manhattan to Brooklyn, and Garrett spent every second of the drive reliving every story he'd ever heard about children and fevers and the things that could go wrong. By the time he reached the hospital, his hands were shaking and his chest felt like it was caught in a vice. He found Nora in the pediatric waiting room, Henry asleep in her lap while she stared at the treatment room doors with hollow, terrified eyes. She looked so small, so fragile, like a strong wind might blow her away. "Any word?" he asked, settling beside her. "They're running tests." Her voice was barely a whisper. "She was so hot, Garrett. I've never been so scared in my life." Without thinking, he put his arm around her. After a moment's hesitation, a pause that felt like an eternity, she leaned into him. They sat like that for hours, sharing the particular agony that only parents know, helplessness in the face of their child's suffering. Garrett had closed deals worth billions, had stared down hostile boards and ruthless competitors, but nothing had ever terrified him like watching Nora fall apart in that hospital waiting room. When the doctor finally emerged with news that Grace would be fine, just a particularly nasty virus, Nora broke down completely. 18 months of single motherhood, of carrying every burden alone, of being strong for everyone else, finally caught up with her. Garrett held her while she sobbed, his own eyes burning with unshed tears. "I'm sorry," he whispered into her hair, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo. "I'm so fucking sorry I wasn't here. I was so alone," she choked out. "There were nights when they both had colic, and I thought I was going to lose my mind. I kept thinking maybe I should call you, but then I'd remember what an ass I was," he finished grimly. She pulled back to look at him, tears still streaming down her face. "Remember how much you valued your freedom. How often you said children would ruin everything you'd worked for." The words were like acid in his veins. "I was terrified," he admitted. "Terrified that I'd be like my father, absent, cold, more interested in profit margins than little league games. I thought if I never tried, I couldn't fail. Instead, you failed without trying." The brutal honesty should have angered him. Instead, it was exactly what he needed to hear. They took Grace home together that morning, both of them exhausted but oddly peaceful. Henry woke up demanding pancakes, oblivious to the night's drama, and somehow Garrett found himself in Nora's kitchen, attempting to flip pancakes while she made coffee. The domesticity of it was overwhelming. This was what he'd thrown away: lazy mornings and sleepy children, and the simple pleasure of making breakfast with someone you loved. "You're burning them," Nora observed, but there was no heat in it. If anything, she sounded almost fond. "I'm learning," he replied, scraping charcoal off the pan with more determination than skill. She moved behind him to adjust the heat, and for one heart-stopping moment, her body pressed against his back. The contact was brief, innocent, but it sent electricity shooting through him like he'd been struck by lightning. It was the first time they'd touched intentionally since his return, and the familiar spark was still there, stronger, if anything, for all they'd endured. Nora felt it too. He could tell by the way she quickly stepped back, color rising in her cheeks like a teenager caught stealing kisses. "The children need consistency," she said, as if reminding herself of something important. "If you're going to be part of their lives, it can't be when it's convenient for you." "I understand." "Do you?" She turned to face him fully, and he saw the vulnerability she was trying so hard to hide. "Because loving them means 2 a.m. fevers and temper tantrums and giving up things you want for things they need. It means being the adult even when you feel like falling apart." "I want to learn," he said simply. "I want to be the father they deserve. The man you needed me to be." Something flickered in her eyes. Hope, maybe, or just exhaustion. "And your company?" "Your empire." "I've been thinking about that." Garrett had, in fact, been thinking about little else since the moment he'd seen those children. "I could step back from day-to-day operations. Focus on strategy, work from home more often." "You do that." "Nora, I have more money than I can spend in 10 lifetimes." He moved closer, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes. "What I don't have is my family. What I don't have is you." The admission hung between them, raw and honest and full of 18 months of regret. Nora's breath hitched, and for a moment, he thought she might close the distance between them. Instead, she stepped back again, rebuilding the walls he'd just started to chip away. "We can't go backwards, Garrett. Too much has happened." "I don't want to go backwards," he said softly. "I want to go forward. With you, with Henry and Grace. I want to build something new." Before she could respond, 2 small bodies barreled into the kitchen, demanding breakfast and attention and all the beautiful chaos that came with being a family. The moment was broken, but something had shifted again, another crack in the wall between them, another step towards something that might, just might, be forgiveness. Over the following months, Garrett threw himself into learning parenthood with the same intensity he'd once reserved for corporate acquisitions. But this time, it felt different. This time, it felt like coming alive. He read every parenting book he could find, turning his sterile penthouse into a child-friendly wonderland complete with safety gates and toy boxes. He gradually increased his time with the twins, learning their rhythms, their personalities, their needs. The children responded to his genuine effort in ways that constantly amazed him. Henry began asking for daddy stories about business meetings, fascinated by his father's world even if he couldn't understand the complexities. "Tell me about the one where you bought the company that makes the apps," he'd demand, settling into Garrett's lap like it was the most natural thing in the world. Grace appointed herself his fashion consultant, regularly critiquing his tie choices with the seriousness of a Fortune 500 board member. "That one makes you look sad, Daddy. We're the blue one. Blue makes people happy." But it was the quiet moments that undid him completely, reading bedtime stories in voices he'd never known he could make, kissing scraped knees better, watching their faces light up when he walked through the door. He began to understand, with startling clarity, what he'd given up in his relentless pursuit of success. More challenging was navigating his relationship with Nora. The attraction between them was undeniable. It sparked every time they touched, every time their eyes met across a playground, every time he caught her watching him with their children. But she kept him at arm's length, friendly but distant, co-parenting but not truly reconnecting. The breaking point came on a rainy Tuesday evening in May. Garrett arrived at Nora's brownstone to pick up the children for their weekly overnight stay, but something was wrong. He could hear it in her voice before he even saw her face. "I understand the deadline," she was saying into her phone, her tone tight with stress. But I can't work 17-hour days anymore. I have children. Garrett had learned enough about her life over the past months to know she'd been struggling to rebuild her career after taking time off when the twins were born. She'd been a successful marketing executive before their marriage, brilliant, innovative, sought after. But single motherhood had forced her to take lesser positions with more flexibility and significantly less pay. "Is everything all right?" he asked when she hung up, noting the tension in her shoulders, the exhaustion in her eyes. "Fine," she said automatically, the kind of reflexive response that meant anything but fine. "Nora." He used the tone that had once made boardrooms fall silent. She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "They want me to travel to Chicago for a week-long campaign launch. It's a huge opportunity, the kind that could put me back on track career-wise. But you can't leave the children. I don't have anyone who can watch them overnight. My mother is visiting my sister in California, and Mrs. Rodriguez next door can only do days. I'll take them." The words came out before he'd fully thought them through, but the moment he said them, he knew they were right. Nora looked at him skeptically. "For a week? Garrett, you've never had them alone for more than 8 hours. Then it's time I learned." He moved closer, drawn by her obvious distress. "Let me help you, Nora. Let me do this. What about your work? Your meetings? Your empire? I told you, I've been scaling back. My assistant can handle most things remotely." He reached out, hesitating just a moment before touching her arm. The contact sent electricity through both of them. "Please, let me prove I can be reliable." The touch, brief as it was, seemed to unravel something in her. Her eyes searched his face, looking for signs of the old Garrett, the one who made promises he couldn't keep, who prioritized everything else over family. "Okay," she whispered finally. "But if anything goes wrong, nothing will go wrong," he said, his thumb stroking across her wrist where her pulse fluttered like a trapped bird. "I promise." The week that followed was absolute chaos. Day 1. Grace came down with a stomach bug that required 3 clothing changes before noon and emergency laundry runs to the 24-hour service down the street. Day 2. Henry decided to test every boundary Garrett had never thought to establish, including whether crayons were edible. They weren't. And if the cat next door could fly, it couldn't, but it could hiss very loudly. Day 3. Both children had simultaneous meltdowns at the grocery store, and Garrett found himself negotiating with 2 screaming toddlers while elderly shoppers gave him looks ranging from sympathy to outright judgment. By day 4, Garrett understood why parents looked so perpetually exhausted. His expensive suits were stained with everything from applesauce to finger paint. His meticulously organized schedule had been thrown out the window in favor of nap times and snack emergencies. His conference calls were interrupted by requests for juice boxes and bathroom assistance. But there were moments of pure magic too. Like Grace falling asleep on his chest during movie night, her small hand curled around his finger, her breathing soft and trusting against his heartbeat. Like Henry proudly showing off his block tower to anyone who would listen, including the mailman, the pizza delivery guy, and Mrs. Chun from downstairs. Like the simple joy of making breakfast together, even if it ended with syrup on everything, including the ceiling. "Daddy, you're funny," Grace announced on day 5, giggling as he tried to brush chocolate pudding out of her hair. "Funny how?" he asked, grateful that she couldn't see his face in the bathroom mirror. Chocolate pudding was apparently much harder to remove than financial projections were to analyze. "You make weird faces when you're trying to fix things." "What kind of weird faces?" She demonstrated, scrunching up her features in exaggerated concentration, and Garrett burst out laughing, the kind of genuine, belly-deep laughter he hadn't experienced in years. "You know what, princess? I think I make weird faces because I'm still learning how to be your daddy." "That's okay," she said seriously, patting his cheek with a sticky hand. "I'm still learning how to be your daughter." The words hit him like a freight train. This beautiful, perfect little girl was learning how to love him, trusting him despite his absence, giving him a gift he'd never deserved. Meanwhile, Henry had appointed himself Garrett's business consultant. "Why do you talk to your computer so much?" he asked, climbing onto Garrett's lap during a video conference with Tokyo. "I'm talking to people who work for my company, but they're very far away. Why don't they just come here?" "Well, Some of them live in other countries. So, Mommy says when you love someone, distance doesn't matter. Out of the mouths of babes. Garrett had spent years building a global empire, convincing himself that physical presence was unnecessary as long as the profits kept flowing. But Henry, in his innocent wisdom, had just articulated something profound about love and presence that all of Garrett's business school education had missed. When Nora returned from Chicago, she found them in Central Park on a glorious Saturday afternoon. All three of them were grass-stained and giggling, and Garrett was on his hands and knees, pretending to be a horse while the twins took turns riding on his back. "Giddy up, Daddy," Grace shrieked with delight, bouncing on his back like a tiny cowgirl. "I'm galloping as fast as I can, Princess," Garrett called back, making exaggerated neighing sounds that sent both children into fits of laughter. "Mommy," Grace spotted her first, scrambling off Garrett's back and running toward Nora with arms outstretched. "Did you miss me?" Nora asked, scooping her daughter up and spinning her around. "Yes, but Daddy makes really good pancakes now," Grace announced proudly. "And he knows all the princess movies." Henry bounded over next, practically vibrating with excitement. "Mom, Dad taught me about time zones. Did you know that when we're eating dinner, people in Australia are eating breakfast?" But it was the look Nora gave Garrett that stopped his breath. As he pushed himself up from the grass, brushing dirt off his jeans, not his usual tailored suits, she studied his face with an expression he couldn't quite read. Warm, proud, and something deeper. Something that looked dangerously like love. "How did it go?" she asked as the children raced ahead toward the playground. "Better than I expected," Garrett admitted, and he meant it. "They're incredible, Nora. I had no idea what I was missing, and the business world didn't collapse without you." He laughed, a sound rich with genuine amusement. "Amazingly, no? Turns out I'm not as indispensable as I thought." They walked in comfortable silence, watching their children play. The evening light cast everything in gold, and Garrett was struck by how perfect this felt, this simple family moment he'd once thought would trap him. "Thank you," Nora said quietly. "For this week, for everything you've been doing. The children adore you. And you." The question slipped out before he could stop it. Nora stopped walking, her eyes searching his face. "Garrett, I know we can't go back," he said quickly, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I know I hurt you in ways that might never heal. But I love you, Nora. I never stopped loving you, and now that I've found my children, found this life I was too stupid to appreciate before." He took her hands in his, gratified when she didn't pull away. "I want to try again. Not the way we were, but something new. Something better." Tears gathered in her eyes, catching the golden light of the setting sun. "I'm scared," she whispered. "What if you change your mind? What if the novelty wears off, and you decide we're holding you back again? Then you remind me of this moment," he said, bringing her hands to his lips and pressing a soft kiss to her knuckles. "You remind me that the only thing that ever held me back was my own fear." They didn't fall back together immediately. Nora was too smart, too careful to trust him completely right away. But something fundamental had shifted between them. The wall she'd built around her heart began to crumble, brick by brick. It started with small things. Garrett staying for dinner after dropping off the children, helping with bath time and bedtime stories. Nora texting him photos from their day, Henry building elaborate block towers, Grace painting masterpieces that looked like abstract explosions of color. There were shared smiles across playground equipment and lingering touches that set them both on fire. Conversations that lasted long into the night after the children were asleep, talking about everything and nothing like they used to when they were young and in love and thought the world was full of infinite possibilities. The first kiss happened 6 weeks later, outside Grace's preschool after a particularly chaotic parent-teacher conference. "So let me get this straight," Garrett said, trying not to laugh as they walked to their cars. Henry tried to explain quantum physics to his classmates during show and tell. Complete with diagrams he drew himself, Nora replied, her eyes bright with mirth. "Mrs. Patterson said she's never seen 3-year-olds look so confused." "And Grace?" Grace told everyone that her daddy used to be mean, but now he's nice, and that sometimes people change their hearts. The words hit Garrett like a physical blow, not painful, but profound. "She said that." "She did." Nora stopped walking, turning to face him fully. Children see things so simply, don't they? People are mean or nice. Hearts change or they don't. Maybe they're right to see it that way. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility. The setting sun painted Nora's hair gold, and Garrett was transported back to that beach in Santorini where he'd first promised to love her forever. "Nora," he said softly, stepping closer. "Yes." Instead of answering with words, he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her softly, tentatively. She stiffened for just a moment, one heartbeat of resistance, before melting into him, her arms winding around his neck. It was gentle, sweet, and absolutely devastating. The kiss tasted like hope and forgiveness, and all the love they'd tried so hard to bury. "This is complicated," she breathed against his lips when they finally broke apart. "The best things always are," he murmured back, his forehead resting against hers. They took it slow, slower than either of them wanted, but Nora insisted they be sure. There were family dinners and movie nights, lazy Sunday mornings, and shared bedtime stories. Garrett found himself falling in love not just with the woman he'd married, but with the mother she'd become, the strength she'd developed in his absence. Every touch was electric. Every glance across a crowded room sent heat racing through his veins. When she laughed at something he said, when she absently touched his arm while talking, when she looked at him with growing trust and affection, it all made him want her with an intensity that sometimes left him breathless. But it wasn't just physical desire, though God knew that was strong enough to bring him to his knees. It was emotional hunger, the need to be close to her, to share everything with her, to rebuild the intimacy they'd lost. The breaking point came on a warm June evening when the children were at Nora's mother's house for their first sleepover since her return from California. Garrett had planned a simple dinner at Nora's apartment, nothing fancy, just the two of them reconnecting without the beautiful chaos of their children around them. But the moment he walked through the door, carrying takeout from her favorite Thai restaurant and a bottle of wine they'd shared on their first anniversary, the careful distance they'd maintained shattered like glass. Nora was in the kitchen, hair piled loosely on her head, wearing a simple sundress that made his mouth go dry. When she turned to greet him, the hunger in her eyes matched his own. "Dinner can wait," she said simply. He was across the room in 3 strides, backing her against the counter as their mouths crashed together. This kiss was different from their first tentative reconnection, desperate, hungry, full of months of suppressed desire and years of separation. "Are you sure?" he managed to ask, even as his hands tangled in her hair, even as she pressed against him like she was trying to merge their souls. "I've never been more sure of anything," she gasped, her fingers already working at the buttons of his shirt. They made it as far as the living room couch before urgency overtook them. Clothes were discarded frantically, hands were learning familiar territory that felt both known and wonderfully new. "I missed you," Garrett whispered against her throat, his lips tracing the delicate line of her collarbone. "God, Nora, I missed you so much." "I know," she breathed, her hands exploring the planes of his chest, marveling at how familiar yet different he felt. "I missed you too. Even when I hated you, I missed you." When he finally slid into her, they both cried out, not just from the physical pleasure, though that was overwhelming, but from the emotional rightness of being connected again. For the first time in years, Garrett felt complete. They moved together with remembered rhythm, building toward a crescendo that left them both shaking and breathless. It was more than sex, more than physical release. It was coming home. It was forgiveness. It was the promise of a future they were both brave enough to reach for. In the aftermath, as they lay tangled together on the narrow couch, Garrett pressed his face into Nora's neck and let himself truly feel what he'd almost lost forever. "I love you," he whispered against her skin, his voice rough with emotion. "I love our family. I love the life we're building." "I love you too," she replied, her fingers tracing lazy patterns on his chest. "God help me, I never stopped." They stayed like that until the candles burned low and the takeout grew cold, holding each other in the golden light of forgiveness and newly rekindled love. "What happens now?" Nora asked softly. "Now," Garrett said, lifting his head to look into her eyes, "we build something beautiful, something that lasts, something worthy of the love we've been given. And if it gets hard, if old patterns try to resurface, then we remind each other why we're fighting for this. We remember this moment, this feeling, these children who need us to get it right. Nora smiled then, the first truly unguarded smile she'd given him since his return. "I'd like that," she said. "I'd like that very much." As they finally moved to the bedroom, as they made love again with tender slowness that spoke of forever rather than desperation, Garrett knew with absolute certainty that he'd finally found his way home. The manipulative CEO who had once seen love as weakness was gone, replaced by a man who understood that the greatest strength came from vulnerability, the greatest success from surrender, and the greatest empire was built not of money and power, but of love freely given and gratefully received. 8 months passed like a beautiful dream that Garrett never wanted to wake up from. He and Nora fell into a rhythm that felt both new and completely natural. Family dinners became sacred time. No phones, no business calls, just the four of them sharing stories about their days. Movie nights turned into elaborate productions with blanket forts and homemade popcorn. Sunday mornings meant pancakes and crossword puzzles while the children played in their pajamas. Garrett had restructured his entire life around his family, and the strangest thing was how easy it felt. He'd spent years believing that love was a cage, that family obligations would suffocate his ambitions. Instead, he discovered that love was actually freedom, the freedom to be his authentic self, to find joy in simple moments, to measure success in hugs and bedtime stories rather than stock prices and profit margins. Manning dynamics continued to thrive under his more balanced approach. His executive team had stepped up beautifully, and Garrett found that working smarter rather than harder actually produced better results. He still closed major deals and made strategic decisions, but now he did it all while coaching Henry's Little League team and attending Grace's dance recitals. "You're different," his longtime business partner Marcus had observed during a board meeting. "Happier. More human, I guess." "Funny what happens when you remember what you're actually working for," Garrett had replied. But the most beautiful change was in his relationship with Nora. They were rebuilding their love brick by brick, creating something stronger and more mature than what they'd had before. Their physical connection was explosive, stolen kisses in the kitchen, heated glances across crowded playgrounds, nights when they came together with a passion that left them both breathless and amazed. More importantly, their emotional intimacy was deeper than ever. They talked about everything, their fears, their dreams, their plans for the future. They supported each other's careers, shared parenting duties with easy teamwork, and found themselves falling in love all over again with the people they'd become. The proposal had been planned for weeks, but when the moment finally came, it was nothing like Garrett had envisioned. Grace's 3rd birthday party was supposed to be a small affair, just family and a few friends from preschool. But somehow, Nora's brownstone was packed with 20 giggling children, harried parents, and enough sugar to power a small city. Garrett had been planning to propose that evening, after the guests left, in the quiet intimacy of Nora's garden. He'd bought the ring weeks ago, a stunning diamond solitaire that was both classic and unique, just like the woman he wanted to marry. The plan was romantic, thoughtful, perfect. But as he watched Nora laugh with their children, chocolate cake smeared on her cheek and pure joy radiating from her face, he realized he couldn't wait another moment. Grace was in full birthday princess mode, wearing a sparkly tiara and a pink tulle dress that made her look like she'd stepped out of a fairy tale. Henry was her devoted knight, helping her open presents and making sure she got the biggest piece of cake. "Daddy," Grace called out when she spotted him across the room. "Come see what Mrs. Chin gave me." She held up a set of watercolor paints, her eyes bright with artistic possibilities. "Now I can paint real pictures like the ones in the museum." "Those are beautiful, princess. What are you going to paint first?" "Our family," she said without hesitation. "Mommy and Daddy and Henry and me, all together." The simple words hit Garrett like lightning. Our family, all together. This beautiful, chaotic, perfect life they'd built from the ashes of his worst mistakes. He looked across the room at Nora, who was cutting cake and orchestrating the beautiful chaos with the skill of a diplomat. She caught his eye and smiled, the kind of smile that reached her soul and reminded him why he'd fallen in love with her in the first place. That's when he knew he couldn't wait. He dropped to one knee right there in the living room, ring box in hand, while 20 preschoolers and their parents watched in stunned silence. "Nora," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the sudden quiet. She turned, saw him kneeling, and her hand flew to her mouth. The serving knife clattered to the floor as tears immediately sprang to her eyes. 3 years ago, I was the biggest fool alive. I had everything that mattered and threw it away because I was too scared to see its value. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, but Garrett only had eyes for Nora. You gave me the most precious gifts imaginable. Our children, your forgiveness, a second chance I didn't deserve. Now I'm asking for one more gift. He opened the ring box, revealing the diamond that caught the afternoon light like captured starfire. Marry me again. Not because we're trying to recapture the past, but because I can't imagine a future without you in it. The room held its collective breath. Henry and Grace pushed through the crowd of children, flanking their parents with wide, curious eyes. Are you asking Mommy to marry you? Grace asked seriously, her tiara slightly askew. I am, Garrett confirmed, his heart hammering against his ribs. What do you think? Grace considered this with the gravity of a Supreme Court justice. Then she turned to the crowd of children and parents. I think, she announced loudly, that you should say yes, Mommy, because Daddy makes really good pancakes now, and he knows all the princess movies, and he gives the best hugs in the whole world. The laughter that erupted broke the tension like a dam bursting. Children cheered, parents applauded, and somewhere in the beautiful chaos, Nora nodded through her tears. Yes, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Yes, to all of it. To the future, to our family, to trying again and getting it right this time. As Garrett slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, just like they were, the entire room erupted in celebration. Henry and Grace launched themselves at their parents, demanding to see the shiny ring, and asking if this meant they were going to have another party. The biggest party ever, Garrett promised, gathering his family in his arms. A party to celebrate the rest of our lives together. The engagement period was a whirlwind of planning, preparation, and pure happiness. But this time was different from their first engagement. This time, they knew exactly what they were committing to, not just the romance and passion, but the daily work of building a life together. They decided to remarry in the same church where they'd first exchanged vows, but everything about the ceremony would be different. This wasn't about a young couple full of dreams and assumptions. This was about two people who had been tested by life, broken by their own choices, and found their way back to love through forgiveness and grace. I want the children to be part of everything, Nora said one evening as they pored over wedding plans at her kitchen table. This isn't just about us anymore. It's about our family. Henry can be the ring bearer, Garrett suggested. He takes his responsibilities very seriously. And Grace can be the flower girl. She's been practicing her princess walk for weeks. They decided on a small ceremony, just family and close friends. Garrett's parents flew in from Seattle, overjoyed to finally meet their grandchildren and amazed by the transformation in their son. Nora's mother cried happy tears and told anyone who would listen about the miracle of second chances. But the most important conversation happened one evening after the children were asleep. Are you sure about this? Nora asked, curled up beside Garrett on the couch. Really sure? Because once we do this, there's no going back. We're choosing each other, choosing this family, for better or worse. I've never been more sure of anything in my life, Garrett replied, tightening his arms around her. You and Henry and Grace, you're my everything. My empire, my success, my reason for breathing. The man who walked away from you doesn't exist anymore. What if he comes back? What if the pressure gets too much and you start feeling trapped again? Garrett was quiet for a moment, considering her fears seriously. Then you remind me of this moment. You remind me that the only thing that ever made me feel trapped was my own fear of vulnerability. You remind me that loving you, loving our children, is the greatest success I'll ever achieve. Nora turned in his arms to face him fully. And if I get scared? If old insecurities surface and I start pushing you away, then I remind you that you're the strongest person I know, that you raised 2 incredible children on your own, and that you're brave enough to trust love again after everything we've been through. They sealed the promise with a kiss that tasted like forever. 6 months later, on a crisp December morning with snow falling like nature's confetti, Garrett Manning and Nora Caldwell were married for the second time. The church was decorated simply, white roses, flickering candles, and garland that smelled like Christmas morning. But the real beauty wasn't in the decorations. It was in the faces of everyone gathered to witness this miracle of love reborn. Henry served as ring-bearer with the gravity of a diplomat carrying state secrets. He practiced his walk down the aisle for weeks, and he executed it with perfect precision, his little face serious with concentration. Grace scattered flower petals with artistic flair, stopping occasionally to examine her handiwork and add extra petals where she felt they were needed. Her flower girl dress was the same shade of pink as her birthday party dress, and she wore her tiara because, as she'd informed everyone, princesses always wear crowns to weddings. But it was the moment when Garrett saw Nora walking down the aisle that nearly brought him to his knees. She was radiant in a simple ivory dress that hugged her curves and flowed like silk. No cathedral train or elaborate beadwork, just elegant simplicity that took his breath away. But it was her face that truly stunned him. The joy, the love, the absolute certainty in her eyes as she walked toward their future together. When they reached the part of the ceremony where they exchanged new vows, words they'd written themselves this time, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. "Nora," Garrett began, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "The first time we stood here, I promised to love you with the arrogance of a man who thought love was just a feeling. Today, I promise to love you with the wisdom of a man who knows love is a choice I make every morning when I wake up, every evening when I come home, every moment in between. I choose you, I choose our children, I choose this beautiful, chaotic, perfect life we're building together." Nora's response left half the congregation sobbing. "Garrett, you taught me that people can change, that love can heal even the deepest wounds, and that forgiveness is not about forgetting the past, but about choosing a different future. I promise to love you not just on the easy days, but on the hard ones. Not just when you're strong, but when you're vulnerable. Not just for who you were or who you might become, but for exactly who you are right now, the man who chose love over fear, family over empire, and us over everything else." When they kissed, sealing their new beginning, Henry cheered loudly and Grace threw the remaining flower petals in the air like confetti. "Now we're really, truly a family," Grace announced to the entire church, and the laughter and applause that followed felt like a blessing from heaven itself. Their second honeymoon was spent at a family resort in the Bahamas, where they built sandcastles by day and made love by moonlight while their children slept peacefully in the adjoining suite. It wasn't the exotic romance of their youth. There were no late nights at exclusive clubs or impromptu adventures to hidden beaches. Instead, there were sunrise walks along the shore while the children collected seashells, afternoon naps in hammocks, and quiet dinners where they talked about everything and nothing. It was deeper, richer, more real than anything they'd shared before. "Do you miss it sometimes?" Nora asked one evening as they sat on their balcony, watching the sunset paint the Caribbean sky in shades of gold and crimson. "The old life? The excitement of constant deals and acquisitions?" Garrett considered the question seriously. "I miss the simplicity of it sometimes. It was easier when success was just a number on a spreadsheet. But miss the actual life? The emptiness, the isolation, the constant hunger for more." He shook his head. "Never. That wasn't living. This is living." Even when Grace has a meltdown in the grocery store and Henry decides to test gravity with your laptop? Especially then, Garrett laughed. "Do you know what I realized this week? Every business deal I ever closed, every acquisition I ever completed, every billion I ever earned, none of it ever made me feel as accomplished as getting Grace to try a new vegetable or helping Henry with his ABCs. "You're going to be such a good dad," Nora said softly. "You already are." "I'm learning," he replied, pulling her closer. "Every day, I'm learning something new about what it means to be a father, a husband, a man worth loving." On their last night, as they sat on the beach watching the waves chase each other to shore, Nora asked the question that had been weighing on her heart. "Do you ever regret it? The path we took to get here? All the pain, the separation, the years we lost?" Garrett was quiet for a long moment, thinking about all they'd endured, the divorce, the loneliness, the mistakes that had nearly cost them everything. "I regret the pain I caused you," he said finally. "I regret the time I lost with the children. I regret that I had to lose everything to understand what truly mattered." He turned to face her, his eyes serious in the moonlight. "But regret the journey that brought us here? Never. We're stronger now, better for each other. Our children have parents who chose love consciously, deliberately, with full knowledge of what it costs and what it's worth. Daddy, Mommy, Grace's voice interrupted from the resort balcony. Henry's being mean. He said my picture of a mermaid looks like a fish. They laughed, the spell of the romantic moment broken but not diminished. This was their life now, beautiful and chaotic, passionate and practical, built on a foundation of hard-won wisdom. As they walked hand in hand back toward their family, Garrett marveled at how completely his definition of success had transformed. 1 year after their remarriage, the Hamilton Manning household bustled with the kind of joyful chaos that could only come from a family that had learned to prioritize love above all else. Spring sunshine streamed through the windows of their new home, a spacious colonial in Westchester that was big enough for everyone but cozy enough to feel like a sanctuary. Garrett had sold his sterile Manhattan penthouse without a second thought, and together they'd created a space that reflected their blended life. Daddy, have you seen my portfolio? Grace called from upstairs, her voice carrying the dramatic urgency that only a 4-year-old could muster. My art teacher wants to see my family paintings. Check the studio, princess. Garrett called back, not looking up from where he was helping Henry build an elaborate block tower in the living room. Next to your easel. The past year had transformed them all in ways both subtle and profound. Grace had blossomed into a confident little artist, her paintings now covering not just the refrigerator but an entire wall they designated as her gallery. Henry had discovered a love of science to go along with his mathematical mind, turning their backyard into an experimental laboratory that made Nora both proud and mildly terrified. But the biggest transformation was in Garrett himself. Manning Dynamics reports record profits under new work-life balance initiative, read the headline in that morning's Wall Street Journal. The article detailed how Garrett's revolutionary approach to corporate culture, prioritizing employee well-being and family time, had actually increased productivity and profits beyond all projections. Other CEOs were calling him for advice. Business schools were studying his methods. But Garrett knew the real secret to his success wasn't a revolutionary business strategy. It was love. Remember when you thought having a family would ruin your career? Nora asked, appearing in the doorway with coffee and that knowing smile he'd fallen in love with all those years ago. I remember being an idiot who thought success was something you achieved instead of something you lived, Garrett replied, accepting the coffee and stealing a quick kiss. And now? Now I know that the only empire worth building is the one that lives in the hearts of the people you love. Henry looked up from his blocks, his serious little face considering this statement. Daddy, what's an empire? An empire, buddy, is something big and important that lasts a long time. Like our family? Exactly like our family. Grace thundered down the stairs, portfolio in hand and paint already smudged on her cheek. I found it. And look, I painted a new picture. She held up her latest masterpiece, a somewhat abstract but clearly heartfelt representation of 4 stick figures holding hands under a rainbow. The figures were labeled in her careful preschool handwriting, Daddy, Mommy, Henry, and me. At the bottom of the page, in letters that mixed uppercase and lowercase with charming inconsistency, she'd written, My happy family. It's perfect, Garrett said, and meant it completely. Can we hang it in your office? Grace asked. So when you're working, you remember us? Absolutely. Right where I can see it every day. As Grace skipped off to get ready for preschool, and Henry returned to his architectural endeavors, Nora curled up beside Garrett on the couch. Do you ever think about the man you used to be? She asked quietly. Sometimes. But he feels like a stranger now, someone I knew once but can barely recognize. Do you miss him? Garrett considered this, watching his children play in the morning light, surrounded by the beautiful chaos of the life they'd built together. I pity him, he said finally. He had everything he thought he wanted and couldn't see that he had nothing that mattered. He was rich in money and poor in love, successful in business and bankrupt in happiness. And now I'm the richest man in the world. Nora smiled, the kind of smile that reached her soul. Yes, you are. As they got ready for another day in their beautiful, ordinary life, school drop-offs and business meetings, art classes and playground visits, Garrett reflected on the journey that had brought them here. 3 years ago, He'd been a man who measured success in quarterly reports and stock prices. He believed that love was weakness, that emotional attachments were liabilities, that the key to happiness was accumulating more money, more power, more control. He'd been wrong about everything. The manipulative CEO who had once prioritized profits over people was gone, replaced by a man who understood that true success couldn't be measured in dollars or market share. It was measured in bedtime stories read, scraped knees kissed better, and quiet moments stolen with the woman who'd given him everything worth having. Success was Henry's laugh when Garrett made silly faces during breakfast. It was Grace's artistic masterpieces that turned their home into a gallery of love. It was Nora's hand in his as they watched their children play, building castles and sandboxes instead of empires in boardrooms. Success was knowing that when his life was over, his legacy wouldn't be the company he'd built or the deals he'd closed or the money he'd accumulated. His legacy would be living in the hearts of two beautiful children who would carry his love forward into the world, and in the heart of the woman who taught him what love really meant. "Daddy, we're going to be late," Henry called, ever the practical one. "Coming, buddy," Garrett called back, but he took one more moment to look around their home, really look at it. The crayon marks on the walls that they'd never paint over because they told the story of their children's creativity. The family photos that chronicled not just special occasions but ordinary moments made precious by love. The comfortable furniture that was built for living, not impressing. This was his empire. This was his kingdom. This was everything he'd ever truly wanted, even when he'd been too blind to see it. As they piled into the car for school drop-off, Henry with his backpack and serious expression, Grace with her art supplies and boundless enthusiasm, Nora with her coffee and patient smile, Garrett felt a peace he'd never known as a corporate conqueror. He'd spent years chasing success, only to discover that success had been waiting for him at home all along. "I love you all," he said as they backed out of the driveway, the same words he said every morning, the same words he'd say every morning for the rest of his life. "Love you too, Daddy," the children chorused. "Love you most," Nora added with a smile. And as they drove toward another day in their perfectly imperfect life, Garrett knew with absolute certainty that he'd finally found what he'd been searching for all along. He'd found his way home. If this story has touched your heart, if it's made you think about what truly matters in your own life, then it's done exactly what it was meant to do. Because here's the truth that Garrett Manning learned the hard way. Success isn't about what you accumulate. It's about what you cultivate. It's not about what you can buy. It's about what you choose to build. It's not about impressing strangers. It's about loving the people who matter most. We live in a world that tells us happiness comes from achievement, that fulfillment comes from acquisition, that love is something we pursue instead of something we practice. But real love, the kind that lasts, the kind that heals, the kind that transforms, isn't something you find. It's something you choose every single day, especially on the days when it's hard. Garrett's story reminds us that it's never too late to change course. It's never too late to apologize. It's never too late to choose love over fear, family over empire, connection over conquest. Maybe you're watching this and thinking about a relationship you need to repair. Maybe you're realizing that the success you're chasing might be costing you the happiness you already have. Maybe you're remembering that the people who love you are more valuable than any achievement, any acquisition, any empire you could ever build. If so, don't wait. Don't assume there will be a tomorrow to make things right. Don't convince yourself that love can wait while you pursue other priorities. Because at the end of your life, when everything else fades away, what will remain is love. The love you gave, the love you received, the love you chose to prioritize when the world told you to want something else. That's the only empire worth building. That's the only success that truly matters. That's the only legacy that lasts forever. If this story inspired you, if it reminded you of what really matters, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Subscribe to Lux Love Chronicles for more stories that will touch your heart and change your perspective on love, success, and what it means to live a life that truly matters. And remember, love isn't just something that happens to you. Love is something you choose to do every single day for the rest of your beautiful, complicated, perfectly imperfect life. Until next time, this is Mr. Wentworth reminding you that the greatest love stories aren't about perfect people. They're about imperfect people who choose to love perfectly. Thank you for watching, and may your own love story be everything you deserve.